The scent of searing flesh, the damp grit of the earth, and the agonizing screams of those dying before they could even let out a full cry. The Mexican highlands in the 16th century were, quite literally, hell on earth. It was a primitive, visceral terror that the invincible conquistadors of the Spanish Empire men who had toppled empires had never before encountered. They were locked in a war against ghosts, known as the Chichimeca. Imagine this: a single arrow, fired from the pitch-black darkness of the brush, pierces your chest in less than a second. You never saw the shooter. You never heard a footstep. How would you feel? This is the brutal, blood-soaked chronicle of how men, chasing the golden dream of silver, were torn apart in shallow canyons, and why the proudest empire on the planet eventually had to throw away its swords and beg for peace with gold. Among the Spanish soldiers, the greatest fear wasn't a head-on battle on an open field. It was the rain of death that poured from the invisible depths of the scrubland. The archery of the Chichimeca warriors was beyond human comprehension. Spanish chroniclers of the time wrote in sheer horror. They could fire 6 arrows with lethal precision before a Spanish cavalryman could even pull the trigger of his musket. These weren't ordinary arrows. Their tips were made of obsidian, flaked to a molecular sharpness that rivaled modern scalpels. The force was so immense that a single shaft could slice through thick cowhide armor, like wet paper, pass entirely through a horse's chest, and emerge from the other side dripping with gore. Visualize this: a knight encased in steel and mounted on a massive warhorse marches forward with the arrogance of a conqueror. He believes he is protected by God and iron. But in a heartbeat, a fountain of dark blood erupts from his horse's neck. As the beast collapses and the knight is thrown into the mud, a sliver of obsidian finds the tiny slit in his helmet. He cannot even scream. He feels the sudden hot tide of his own blood, filling his mouth, gasping for air as he claws at the mud until his fingernails peel off, dying in the muck without ever seeing his executioner's face. For the Chichimeca, the concept of mercy did not exist. They did not grant their Spanish captives the kindness of a quick death. They would take a jagged blade and systematically sever the tendons in the prisoner's wrists and ankles so they could not crawl away. Then they would begin to peel the skin slowly. The echoes of the victim's wails would bounce off the canyon walls like a macabre festival song, a sound the Chichimeca warriors seemed to relish. When Spanish supply units would later stumble upon the site, all they would find were the pelts of their comrades, dangling from tree branches and fluttering in the wind. The shh sound of dried human skin rubbing together became a psychological poison for the survivors. Amidst the buzzing of flies and the suffocating stench of rot, would you have had the strength to take another step? Or would you have ripped off your heavy armor and run until your lungs burst? This tragedy was fueled by one thing: bottomless human greed. After destroying the Aztecs, Spain heard whispers of a mountain of silver to the north. This land, Zacatecas, was a literal jackpot, but it was home to tribes who had survived that harsh terrain for millennia. The Spaniards looked down on them as beasts and monsters without speech. They believed their civilized, holy army would easily crush a few naked savages. It was a fatal delusion born of pure hubris. The Chichimeca had no cities to besiege. They moved like the wind and vanished like smoke. When the Spanish dragged their heavy, thundering cannons into the hills, the enemy was already gone. But in the dead of night, as the exhausted soldiers tried to sleep, eerie, animal-like howls would surround the camp. A sentry, shivering at a sudden chill down, his spine would turn around a second too late. A cold obsidian blade would open his throat, and the warm blood would soak his tunic before he hit the ground. The next morning, his comrades would find him hanging upside down, his abdomen sliced open and his entrails spilled onto the dirt. The Chichimeca knew that fear was a more effective weapon than any bullet. The war dragged on for 40 agonizing years. The Spanish government declared a war of fire and blood, escalating the brutality. They slaughtered Chichimeca men, women, and children indiscriminately, or sold them into soul-crushing slavery. They shackled the ankles of infants and cut out the tongues of the elderly. But this eye for an eye strategy backfired spectacularly. The fractured tribes, who used to fight among themselves, united for the first time. They learned. They adapted. They began using captured muskets and, most terrifyingly, they mastered the horse. The savages were now demons on horseback, wielding Spanish steel with the same terrifying proficiency as the conquistadors themselves. Consider this chilling detail: the Chichimeca began, using the hollowed-out skulls of fallen Spaniards as ceremonial drinking cups. Imagine being a young soldier watching from a distance as the firelight glinted off the cranium of your former bunkmate, now filled with fermented wine. These men crossed an ocean for silver cities, only to find their own gray matter being toasted by their enemies. Finally, the Spanish crown was forced into a humiliating realization. The cost of the war in both gold and lives was far exceeding the wealth coming out of the mines. Soldiers were mutinying, crying that they would rather face the gallows than the ghosts of the North. This is when Miguel Caldera stepped onto the stage of history. Born to a Spanish father and a Chichimeca mother, he understood both sides of the bloodbath. He told the empire, if you cannot conquer their bodies with iron, buy their souls with bread. This was the beginning of the purchase for peace, one of the most surreal turning points in colonial history. The world's most powerful empire began paying tribute to the tribes they once called animals. Every year, massive shipments of corn, beef, and fine European fabrics were sent to the Chichimeca. They were given land, farming tools, and even subsidies to settle down. Peace, which couldn't be won by 10,000 swords, was bought with a loaf of bread and a warm coat. History is written by the victors, but who really won here? Spain kept its silver, but its imperial pride was left in tatters, dragged through the dirt. The Chichimeca survived, but in accepting the gifts, they slowly lost the wild, fierce culture that had made them legends. The peace was real, but it was built on a foundation of uncounted bones. Look at the peaceful highlands of modern Mexico. Can you believe that these very hills once saw human skins used as flags? That these trails were once slick with the blood of men whose eyes were pierced by obsidian? If you were a Spanish soldier back then, hearing that haunting laughter in the dark every single night, would you have marched toward the silver? Or would you have ended your own life just to escape the shadow of the Chichimeca? Did this brutal dive into the dark side of history keep you on the edge of your seat? It's a stark reminder of the hell human greed can create. If you found this story compelling, I'll be back with even more shocking tales from our past. I leave you with this: is a peace bought with gold truly a victory, or just a different kind of surrender? Let me know what you think in the comments.